Mediatonic, the developers behind Fall Guys, had a secret Discord server with some of the best map makers in the community, allowing them early access to new features and tools and get feedback from the developers. I even had a chance to talk to someone who was a part of the program, but due to signing an NDA, they wish to stay anonymous. The handling of this server and the lackluster updates has led to some of the most popular map makers to outright quit the game. On June 25th, 2025, popular Fall Guys personality FG Muffins made a series of posts on Twitter going over the existence of a Discord server that housed some of the most popular map makers the game has to offer. Real players who spend their free time making wonderful maps for people to enjoy without any financial incentive. In February 2024, creators would receive a DM inviting them to join the Fall Guys Community Creators Program, in which they'll get early access to new features, tools, and themes found in the level editor, and along with that, being able to give feedback directly to the developers. Once in the program, they'll give you tips and feedback on your levels, and most importantly, they'll let you know ahead of time what theme you should make your level. And if your level does get chosen, it'll be added as the update rolls out to all players. With how similar these updates have gotten, you may be mistaken to think these levels will be added to Creator Spotlight. However, the invites were sent out during the survival update, aka 10.8, and for reference, Knockout wouldn't release until 3 months later. In order to be eligible for the Community Creators Program, you have to be 18 and above, have access to a PC with the Epic Games launcher, and are required to sign a non-disclosure agreement or an NDA, which is a legal contract that makes it to where you can share what you're about to learn and or receive in this case. According to Muffins, a total of 3 invites were sent out, and my source tells me that the server had 30 creators and 12 Mediatonic employees. The program being limited to PC makes sense since it's much easier to give players a new build that consists of a new editor, content, and themes. It would also make troubleshooting significantly easier. However, they could have included console players regardless, but asked them to make levels with the tools available in normal creative mode, since they could still get feedback from the developers, all the while sharing feedback about creative mode to the developers themselves. According to Muffins, the program started out smoothly. Mediatonic gave a briefing on what they look for in a level, gave feedback, and reviewed the maps that would get submitted. Eventually, the time came to release these maps into the world, and what better way to do it with the launch of a new update. On May 7th, 2024, Mediatonic released the Fall Forever update, aka the 10.9 update, and with it came Knockout, a mode that would contain both Unity classic maps and rounds made in Fall Guys Creative. All the creative mode levels featured were made by the community, 23 creative and 17 Unity levels which were made by Mediatonic obviously. And while majority of the levels were made by the people in the Community Creators Program, not every level in Knockout was made by people in the program. My anonymous source gave me the exact numbers, but I'll go into detail about that later in the video. In my personal opinion, there couldn't have been a worse way to launch these levels. Here's but a small reminder of the fiascos that was the first week of 10.9. They removed solos, limited games to 3 rounds, and made drastic changes to squads and duos. In the previous update, that had been 10.8 aka Survival Update, squads had 60 levels, 5 of them being creative rounds, all of them made by the community. Duos had 57 maps, 5 of them being creative rounds. However, all 3 modes had different levels, which makes sense. But in 10.9, Knockout, squads, and duos share the same round pool, so you can imagine how much of a shock it was to go from 55 Unity levels to 17, and for one reason or another, people were not happy. While I personally don't mind creator-made rounds in general, the race levels featured in 10.9 were pretty enjoyable, but the survival levels, not so much. When Meow 4 Royale came out, the map was so massive when it first released that it was basically impossible to die, so you just hang out until it times out. Fall Royale fell into similar issues, it was just way too big. Lake in the Mountains had an exploit to where you could get on top of the signage by being blasted upwards. Trampeles Temposas had this rhino figure you could jump dive onto, basically negating the entire level. Some of these issues are so glaringly obvious that it feels like Mediatonic didn't playtest these levels at all, and if they did, they clearly weren't giving adequate feedback. And while creators would make changes to their maps based on actual feedback from the community, and in the case of Trampeles Temposas, Mediatonic pushed out an updated version of the level 2 days into the update. However, some weren't as fortunate. While this example is from the 5th rotation, which took place during Scraphead Stumble, the creator of Invasion of the Bean Snatchers tagged Fall Guys and Fall Guys Owl on Twitter, asking them to update the map since they patched some of the exploits and tweaked the UFOs based on the player feedback. However, 2 weeks later, and the levels still didn't get updated, which is just absurd. Levels can sometimes get updated in 2 days or 2 weeks, and while you can't expect Mediatonic to update levels the instant they get updates, since they'll need to verify the map, which could take take time, however the time it takes to update a level shouldn't be so inconsistent. I decided to ask Anon about this, and here's what they said. For the first rotation, Mediatonic checked if levels got updated on their end, and generally updated after the creators requested one. Although Mediatonic themselves said they can't push out updates frequently and often because, quote, it can cause inconvenience to players. Anon added that players would need to download a content update, and sometimes it would mean disbanding your party since it would kick you back to the splash screen. They mentioned the review process and it requires the input of many employees. While I understand you want to review any edits to make sure it follows your standards, but this process feels bloated. Why do you need creators to request an update when you know from your system that they've updated the levels? It feels like an unnecessary step, but maybe I'm missing something. As for the part of them not wanting to update levels too quickly since it'll disrupt play sessions, I kinda get that because players will leave at the slightest bit of inconvenience, but I feel like with the awful state of Knockout and the game in general during its first rotation, maybe this shouldn't have been a concern, especially if the updates were substantial enough to warrant inconveniencing your players. While we aren't sure how many people exactly were required to review and give inputs, this just slows everything down and is just peak corporation. Although all of this gets thrown to the wayside during Scrapyard Stumble, aka 11.2, where they ignored update requests for over a month and only updated their levels, and the cherry on top is they never explained why, nor did they say they would be unable to communicate due to obligations. Honestly, a classic strategy in Mediatonic's playbook. But let's circle back to the first rotation. There was a level called Fancy's Rotation which originally released as a finale. However, it would get converted to a survival level on May 15th, which was when the second rotation released. And this may not sound like a big deal to most, but being able to change whether or not your map is a finale or not is crazy. Creators intended for the levels to be played in a certain way. You can set a qualification limit and Mediatonic can just come in and change it after the fact. The third knockout rotation took place on May 29th, 2024, and they got rid of all but one survival map, that being Blastgone, which is literally just a bunch of hex tiles with drums. As a player, I didn't really mind that the survival levels were gone, just wasn't a fan of them personally, but I can imagine it being demoralizing to see your map get removed like that, especially if they were the only maps of yours that got added. Knockout was out for 22 days and you couldn't just scrap together one or two more survival levels from your community creators Discord program that you had? Like, dude, come on, man. Remember how I mentioned that not every level in Knockout is from the creator community program? Yeah, let's get into that. According to my source, creators in the program didn't want the exclusivity or for Mediatonic to only feature their maps. The server had channels for level recommendations, where people in the program could submit recommendations for levels made by creators who are not in the program to help them get seen. Map makers in the server had a separate channel in where they could submit their own levels. Anonymous did recall that both channels were monitored equally. Personally, knowing how Mediatonic were doing this whole saga, I don't believe it. But again, that's just my personal opinion on that. For the first knockout rotation, levels made by creators from the program, 11. Levels made by creators not from the program, 12. From this number, levels made by creators who join the server later, 5. Levels made by creators who never joined the server, 7. Mediatonic didn't remove any levels from the second rotation, they only changed Fancy's rotation from a finale to a survival. So let's go to the third rotation. For the third rotation, they changed the round pool due to player feedback. Levels made by creators from the program, 9. Levels made by creators not from the program, 7. From this number, levels made by creators who join the server later, few weeks or months after their levels have already been featured in Knockout, 4. Levels made by creators who never join the server, 3. And the first one to include Mediatonic creator levels. MT made levels, 6. Levels made by creators in the program, including those who recently joined in the second wave of invites, 15. Levels made by creators not from the program, 4. Scrapyard Knockout round pool, including the addition of following levels, the last round pool before MT completely removed all community levels from KO and changed KO to be purely Mediatonic made levels. MT made levels, 19. Levels made by creators from the program, 7. Levels made by creators not from the program, 3. In total, 42 levels were made by people in the program and 17 were made by people who never joined the server. Of these, 71.19% were made by people in the program and 28.81% were made by people who never joined the server. Mediatonic could have done a better job of featuring more levels from people who are not part of the server. What's messed up is that during Scrapyard Stumble aka 11.2, Mediatonic had the ability to make team-based levels in creative mode, but didn't share that with the people in the program. It's been 9 months since that update and people still can't make team-based levels. Remember how I mentioned that it feels like Mediatonic didn't play test the levels they featured? Well, for the 4th rotation, which started on July 23rd, 2024, they featured a level that had a budget of 14,793. The level was called Block Garden, and it would get removed on August 1st. It took 9 days for them to remove the level, and the fact that it even got featured at all is crazy. The sheer laziness on display is astounding. This isn't a level that's 500 or 1,000 over budget. No, it's over 10 times that. This level was in rotation when the mobile port released. I wouldn't be surprised if their game just crashed when loading into the level. Mediatonic wouldn't release their own levels into Knockout until 11.1, aka the July 2024 update. They were ready to join the rest of their community. Surely nothing will go wrong, right? And you know what? Even with the disaster that was week 1 of the Fall Forever update, at least creators in the Community Creators Program had the reassurance that they'll get to talk to developers directly and get early access to tools needed to make the best levels they can. However, around this time, or around July 2024, it seems like Mediatonic weren't communicating with the members of the Discord, and creators rightfully started asking about the early builds. You know, the ones they were promised they'd get. When I read this over on Twitter, I was perplexed, because if I read the tweets right, they started asking around July, even though most of the creators were asked to join in February. So 5 months in and you didn't even give them early builds? Mediatonic would respond that they're dealing with technical difficulties and that they're trying, which sucks but understandable. But eventually creators will get the early builds, right? Months went by and people were asking about the early builds that they were promised. But Mediatonic said the issue is a lot more complex, but rest assured it will be coming soon. Eventually Scrap by Stumble AK 11.2 released, which was a huge update and personally one of my favorites. However, same song and dance. People ask, they get the same response, or just flat out ignored. And eventually, with the introduction of the November 2024 update, aka 11.4, Mediatonic announced they would remove all community levels from Knockout and only feature levels in Knockout that were made by Mediatonic going forward. However, the community creator members knew as far back as October 17th, and this was truly a slap in the face to people who poured hours making their maps the best it can be, just for a chance to be featured in a core mode. This was even a slap in the face to the people who had levels featured in Knockout, and knowing this is basically a slap in the face to people who just like creator made rounds in general. Hell, Mediatonic even sent a message to the server after the first rotation saying that their goal isn't changing and that they'll continue to include player made rounds and even have a focus on them. And that, coupled with the lack of communication, I can see why the creators were downright confused and angry. And you know what the real kicker was? They were never told about LTMs in advance, nor were they given themes or asked to create something in advance. The real kick in the pelvis is that they will be given a list of upcoming LTMs but told right away that round pools are already finalized and they cannot submit anything for these. So like, what was the point in even giving the list in the first place? Mediatonic even mentioned how they updated the round pool to have empty main levels as a way to prepare for ranked, and how they wanted to have a high degree of control over the levels in ranked. But like, you could still do that? You had a whole review process. If anything, I feel like player made rounds would have made ranked more fun to play. They also wanted Knockout to be a stress-free version of ranked, which is why the round pools are the same. I feel like this holds back ranked because they can't put a level that's too challenging or difficult since it'll have to be featured in regular Knockout. Ranked Knockout has SBMM or skill-based matchmaking and the regular version doesn't. But it feels like there's no real difference between the two, since I'll still get newbie players when I'm in Superstar, aka the final rank. So at that point, why would I even want to play regular Knockout? I get more out of playing ranked Knockout, like an actual skin and a ton of kudos and crowns at the start of an update if I reach a high enough rank, whereas I get nothing or close to nothing for playing regular Knockout. I believe the round pools shouldn't be the same. It would make both shows stand out and give people a slightly different experience, especially if ranked had rounds made by the community. I would have loved to see Dual Climb, Rotation Station, and Rainbow Rumble in ranked Knockout. And heck, they could even add these challenging community made rounds into ranked Knockout, because obviously with ranked, people expect it to be difficult or a bit more of a challenge. Although with all that said, Mediatonic didn't fully abandon creators, because they released Creator Spotlight, a mode that would contain curated maps in the format of Explore. Here's how Mediatonic broke the news to people in the server. I won't read all of this, so please pause and read it for yourself if you wish to do so. First of all, insane glazing from someone who ignored and stopped updating levels made by a community. Interesting how they specified how it wouldn't be updated to a specific cadence, but it would end up getting updated every 2 weeks. So that statement was false, in a good way, but false nonetheless. Quote, "There are several reasons that make curation for Knockout complicated," End quote. Let's just be honest. It was complicated because you stopped caring after you realized how much time and effort it took to communicate, curate, review, and continuously update levels made by people who weren't on your payroll. Having maps be featured in a show that's a reskinned Explorer makes it to where they have almost no stakes. In course or race levels, the qualification rate is set to 100%, meaning everyone can qualify, and survival rounds are set to 70%. While Explorer and Creator Spotlight offer an experience different from traditional Fall Guys and certainly have their place, however, it shouldn't be the only way people play levels made by the community. Players, especially people in the Discord, build their levels in where only a certain percentage of players can qualify. By putting levels that have certain limitations into a mode that has no limits, you aren't playing the way creators intended. And in my opinion, the biggest issue I don't see people talk about is that with Creator Spotlight having over 300 levels, most of them will be forgotten by the general audience, since there's a high chance the same level won't appear. Players can't learn the shortcuts, strats, or the optimal way to play the level if they've only played it once or twice. For most of the game's existence, you play a round and you either qualified or died. You might have learned the best way to play them, shortcuts that gave you an edge, but most importantly, you built a connection to the levels. Whereas with Creator Spotlight, it's just content. It's as comparable to fast food. Even with all that, people would ask, where's the early build? When are we going to get it? And at this point, you would think Mediatonic would just drop the charade and just give up and just admit that it's not happening. And that's exactly what happened. Sometime in April 2025, or over a year later, they let their members know that early builds aren't happening, making this basically a royal waste of time. Once Mediatonic started putting their levels in Knockout, that's when the lack of communication started, and it may be a coincidence, but I think not. During Scrap or Stumble, Mediatonic would continuously keep their maps up to date on a weekly basis, whereas creators who updated their maps within their first week wouldn't have the changes implemented until over a month into the update. While it is understandable that Mediatonic are going to prioritize their own maps, especially since it's a knockout and they can fast track through the process, taking 2 weeks to a month to push out updated maps made by a community is just absurd, especially if these maps are featured in one of your modes. They thought that Creator Spotlight would be the solution to the problem, but it wasn't, because it's not the way they want their maps to be experienced. They don't want people to play a watered down or baby version that'll be forgotten the next day. Creator Spotlight will get updated every 2 weeks or around 2 weeks, like one or more day less, and provide new and creative levels to play. However, on June 23rd, 2025, Creator Spotlight would only replace one level, and this was due to the level being unpublished. This was odd because every rotation has added levels. The next day, FG Muffins would make a tweet saying that Mediatonic intends to stop updating Creator Spotlight, which didn't really make the situation any better. Before the 11.3 update, Mediatonic would ask creators which legacy objects they'd most like to see come to Creative next, and at the moment, none of these objects are here. The same question was asked a second time and nothing. Mediatonic basically just lied to their most dedicated creators, wasted the time, had a chance to observe and learn from some of the top creators, and gave those same creators nothing in return. Just downright despicable. With everything I just mentioned on top of the updates to creative mode being lackluster, like we haven't gotten a new obstacle since the following 2024 update, aka 11.3 update, creators just don't feel like there's any incentive to make levels anymore. Mediatonic clearly didn't care about the members in the server. They clearly don't care about creators in general, since they don't feature them in Knockout and hog features while updating their own levels over others. The updates last for 2 months now, whereas previously it would last for 1 month. The last meaningful update was 9 months ago or Scrap or Stumble, and as I've said like in previous videos, I don't expect every single creative mode update to be this super bombastic and just update that just adds everything that people want. But like a 9-month gap? That's insane. Over the course of creative mode's existence, Mediatonic have only made 3 LTMs that feature community levels in the style of regular modes, as in there's a round 1, 2, and a finale, where the last guy or group wins. You know, the traditional Fall Guys experience, the foundation on which the game was built on. The 3 LTMs in question being Winter Wonders, Wilderness Falls, and Fall Guys Game, and the last one aired recently, or from June 24th to July 8th. It was funny about that LTM in particular, it contained a modded map that had a budget of 6,000, even though the creator had a version that has 2 2.4K budget, which falls in line with the 2.5K budget found in normal creative mode. And I believe they swapped it, but the fact that this is the second time or the second instance of them not checking whether or not a level is modded is ludicrous. Modded levels have been known to cause issues to lower end hardware, and it's also quite unfair to people who try and make the levels within the limitations of vanilla creative. Like, there's a website where you can input a level and it'll show you how much budget it's using. People loved Wilderness Falls since it featured community levels in the traditional format, first featured in the Fall and Fantasy update aka 11.6. It will be brought back in the Metropolis update aka 19.0. And while they did make another LTM similar in vein, that being Fall Guys game, it only has 4 rounds made by the community. Can we also talk about Fall Jam? Like, what happened to that? The tag is still in the game, even though they did like one, if I recall correctly, and that was during the Halloween update aka 11.3. Mediatonic are at a point where they think they no longer need the community's help as they have the knowledge and tools to make good levels. However, their levels pale in comparison to some of the best creators, and just the sheer size of creators will always outweigh Mediatonic's map maker team. Rather than ignoring your community and pretending nothing's wrong, make amends. You can't pretend it's the legacy days anymore, in which you were the only ones providing the content. Creators have been a part of the game since the beginning of creative mode, and have been attached to your core modes as far back as Power Party, with Ruta and El Selva and Rotation Station being added to solos on January 16th, 2024, then adding them to duos and squads in the Shapes and Stickers update, aka 10.7, along with 3 more community-made maps to solos, squads, and duos. Can't forget all these shuffle LTMs, such as Digi Shuffle, Solo Shuffle, Squads Shuffle, Survival Shuffle. All of these featured community-made maps. Hell, they feature levels in the show selector as one-round experiences as far back as the Summer Breeze update, aka 10.3. Your top creators feel betrayed by your lack of communication and were let down for almost an entire year. They wanted to help you make your game better. They wanted to give back to the game that provided them endless amounts of entertainment. And while this game will always have talented creators creating wonderful maps, but how long will they stay? How long will they tolerate lackluster updates that add nothing but stickers and decorations? People's kindness, understanding, and patience can only go so far. This game has been in a rough spot for months now, and putting your head down isn't going to make it go away. Special thank you to my anonymous source for coming out and sharing their story. Do check the description. I will try and link as much stuff relating to the story as I can. And special thank you to our Max store, aka $5 members, Jabba Runnin, Dekel, the Editor, Actually Profi, T-Man, The Salt, TM, and Scrawny for your support as always.